They weren't just symbols. These gods were real to their believers, more real than kings, more commanding than generals. Across Africa, before and beyond the Age of Empires, warriors knelt before deities of war, offered blood, fire, and vows, and marched into battle believing they were not alone. Thunder cracked not as a storm, but as Shango's rage. The clang of metal wasn't just a forge, it was Ogun breathing life into a blade. These were not just myths, they were war strategies wrapped in spirit. But here's the mystery. How did belief in these gods physically shape the outcome of battles? Why did entire armies refuse to move without signs from the spirit world? What made a talisman more crucial than a sword? And why have so many of these divine warriors been erased from textbooks and museums? We're diving into the gods that whispered tactics in dreams, turned farmers into fierce battalions, and rewrote history, not with pen and ink, but with ash and steel. Every culture has war gods. But African war deities weren't abstract. They lived through rituals, sacrifices, masks, drums, and trance. A warrior didn't just carry a spear. He carried centuries of ancestral power, invoked through chants, tattoos, and secret oaths. A battlefield wasn't just terrain, it was a sacred space where gods watched, judged, and even fought. In this video, we're traveling through myths and memories, through royal courts and rebel forests. You'll meet Ogun, the unstoppable force of iron and invention; Shango, the fiery, vengeful king of lightning; spirits that led the Zulu under Shaka; secret war cults that used shadows, fear, and ritual to control entire regions. From the pre-colonial kingdoms to the fires of modern rebellion, war gods were more than religion. They were strategy, identity, and survival. We won't just explore who they were, but how they worked. What rituals summoned them? How were warriors chosen, trained, and transformed? Why did they fast, bleed, and dance for war? And why are these powerful spiritual forces still echoing through today's music, fashion, and resistance movements? Myth is memory, and in Africa, memory has always been alive. If you think gods only belong in books and temples, think again. These deities walked with soldiers, hid in forests, screamed through thunder, and carved their names into history. And the deeper you look, the more you'll see. The wars were never just between men, they were between gods. In many African societies, war wasn't just a political act, it was spiritual theater. Before a spear was lifted or a battle horn was blown, warriors consulted diviners, sacrificed animals, and danced for hours, invoking unseen forces. The spirit world was not separate from war, it was its engine. Battles were not simply contests of strength, but trials of divine favor. If the gods did not approve, no warrior would march, no chief would issue the order. War was a sacred rite. Elders poured libations into the earth, praying to ancestors for protection. Medicine men prepared spiritual armor, amulets, powders, carvings that were believed to make men bulletproof, invisible, or invincible. Fighters carried charms sewn into their clothing, blessed in rituals that fused herbal science with divine invocation. Every movement, every weapon, every chant had meaning. This was a battlefield consecrated by blood and belief, not just by strategy and steel. Priests were as crucial as generals. They determined battle days through signs, dreams, and omens. If a goat's liver appeared wrong during divination, battle might be delayed for weeks. If thunder struck on a clear day, it was read as a message from Shango. A priest's refusal to bless an army could collapse entire campaigns. Commanders didn't argue with spirits, they obeyed them. Without spiritual sanction, defeat was considered inevitable, no matter the strength of arms. Divine influence extended to tactics. In some regions, warriors performed ritual dances before entering enemy territory, believed to confuse or paralyze opponents spiritually. The battlefield was prepared like a temple, cleansed, blessed, and marked with sacred symbols. The war drums were not just rhythm. They were language, prayer, and command rolled into one. Every beat could summon ancestral spirits or intimidate enemies who feared spiritual wrath more than swords. In Yoruba land, war and religion were inseparable. The god Ogun, patron of warriors and blacksmiths, was invoked before forging weapons and again before battle. His followers believed he lived in iron itself, giving life to swords and strength to those who carried them. The failure to honor Ogun could lead to disaster, broken weapons, confusion, even death. Victory was less about brute force and more about spiritual alignment and respect. Among the Igbo, warrior societies like the Otu Ozo or Ekbe were not just military, they were spiritual orders. Initiation into these brotherhoods involved sacred oaths, fasting, and tests of endurance that fused personal transformation with divine allegiance. In war, these groups led the charge, their faith making them fearless. They weren't just men. They were vessels of divine power, moving with ancestral precision and divine mission. Even the fear of spiritual reprisal shaped warfare. Many warriors believed that unjust killings would haunt them, literally. Spirits of the wrongly slain could return as malevolent forces bringing illness or madness. This belief restrained excess violence and enforced a moral code. War wasn't chaos, it was a sacred transaction, one that demanded honor, ritual, and divine witness. Without that balance, warriors feared they would lose more than just battles, they would lose their souls. Colonial observers often misunderstood these practices, dismissing them as superstition. But they missed the deeper truth. African warfare was an integration of strategy, culture, and cosmic understanding. The gods were not decorations of war, they were its architects. They dictated who won, who survived, and who was remembered in songs and shrines. This spiritual infrastructure turned the act of war into a dance between worlds, seen and unseen, flesh and spirit. Warriors fought not just for land or glory, but to fulfill divine obligations. This mindset didn't just shape the outcome of battles, it shaped entire societies. It bonded communities through faith and forged warriors with more than courage. They fought with conviction, blessed by gods. In the forests of West Africa, where fire met metal, Ogun was born. He was not just a god, he was a force. The Yoruba people revered him as the god of iron, war, and transformation. To call upon Ogun was to summon both destruction and creation, bloodshed and invention. His symbol wasn't a throne or a star or a staff, it was the machete, the hammer, the anvil. In Ogun there was no separation between the forge and the battlefield. Myths say Ogun was the first Orisha to descend to earth. When others hesitated at the chaos of the world, Ogun cut a path through the wilderness with his iron blade. This act made him the god of pioneers and warriors, those who clear the way where others fear to go. His energy was raw, restless, and relentless. It's said that if not appeased, Ogun would turn his tools against his own worshippers, consuming them in madness and fire. In African warfare, Ogun's presence was essential. No warrior forged a weapon without first honoring him. Blacksmiths, the sacred artisans, were Ogun's earthly avatars. They created blades not just with skill, but with prayer. Every spark from the forge was seen as a whisper from the god himself. Before a battle, fighters offered dogs, palm wine, or their own blood to Ogun, asking for strength, courage, and divine fury. Ogun was not only about war, he was about justice. In many Yoruba villages, disputes were settled in his shrine. Oaths were sworn before iron objects believed to carry his essence. If someone lied while touching Ogun's blade, punishment was expected: sickness, madness, or even death. This fear made Ogun a moral compass. In war, he didn't just grant victory, he judged the righteousness of the cause. When colonial armies invaded, Ogun's role intensified. Facing guns and steel, African resistance fighters leaned into their spiritual traditions. Ogun became more than a god, he was a symbol of technological mastery and ancestral defiance. In the 20th century, the Mau Mau rebels in Kenya and other liberation fighters adapted Ogun's rituals, blending indigenous spirituality with guerrilla warfare. In their eyes, Ogun was still fighting, this time against foreign domination. Ogun's imagery was everywhere. His shrine could be a simple iron bar driven into the ground, or a full altar with red and black cloth, machetes, and chains. His colors symbolized fire and iron, blood and boundary. His followers, often called the children of Ogun, were known for their fearlessness. They were the first into the forest, the first to strike. To be chosen by Ogun was to live on the edge of control and chaos. Unlike other deities who preferred calm, Ogun thrived in intensity. His festivals included animal sacrifices, gunpowder, and ecstatic dances that bordered on dangerous. Worshippers would enter trance states, slashing the air with machetes, walking barefoot on fire, or handling iron without injury. These weren't theatrics, they were sacred performances of power. Ogun didn't demand quiet devotion. He wanted your blood hot, your heart wild, your spirit aflame. But Ogun was also a healer of societies and souls. His connection to iron made him the god of tools and industry. Farmers honored him for their hoes. Hunters prayed to him before entering the bush. Mechanics, welders, soldiers, even taxi drivers today hang iron charms in their workshops or cars. He is modernity rooted in mythology, a divine engineer of civilization. The diaspora carried Ogun across oceans. In Brazil, he became Ogun. In Haiti, he fused with St. George. In Trinidad, he is honored in Shango Baptist rites. Each version retained his core, the sacred fusion of iron, fire, and fight. African slaves who were stripped of language and land still clung to Ogun's power, hiding his worship within Catholic saints or folk rituals. Through him, they remembered who they were and what they had survived. Today, Ogun still inspires. Artists carve sculptures in his honor. Musicians invoke him in songs. Activists wear his colors during protests. He is a timeless figure of strength through skill, peace through force, and justice through fire. Where others hesitate, Ogun moves. Where others talk, Ogun acts. He is both sword and smith, destroyer and creator, rage and redemption combined. Understanding Ogun means understanding the African philosophy of balance. The blade that defends can also kill. The fire that warms can also burn. He reminds us that war, while violent, can also be sacred. That in every act of destruction, there is the possibility of rebuilding. And that courage in its purest form is both spiritual and physical, rooted in tradition and forged in fire. Ogun's story is still unfolding in factories, on battlegrounds, in temples, and in hearts. He is the god who cleared the way, and those who carry his fire still blaze trails today. Iron sharpens iron. And in Ogun's world, the strongest warrior is the one who walks with purpose, tempered by the heat of the forge and the weight of the ancestors. When the skies darkened and thunder rolled across the land, it wasn't just weather, it was Shango, the god of lightning, speaking. In Yoruba tradition, Shango was more than a storm deity. He was a former king turned divine judge, a warlord whose power transcended the throne and exploded into the heavens. His myth is electric. Raging fire from the skies, drums that summon storms, and a voice that splits the air with justice. Shango's legend begins as a mortal ruler, said to be the fourth king of the Oyo Empire. He was a fierce and ambitious leader, known for his military might and fiery temperament. According to myth, he possessed magical powers that allowed him to summon lightning and destroy enemies from afar. But after a tragic misuse of his power led to destruction, Shango took his own life. Or so it seemed. Instead of dying, he ascended into the divine realm, forever becoming the Orisha of thunder and wrath. In the heat of battle, warriors called upon Shango not just for strength but for righteous vengeance. He wasn't just about violence, he was about balance. Shango punished those who abused power, struck down liars and traitors, and rewarded loyalty with fire from the sky. His sacred emblem, the double-headed axe, symbolized justice and power wielded in both directions, to protect and to destroy. Shango's presence was felt through music. His followers used the bata drums to call him down. The rhythm wasn't entertainment, it was invocation. In war, the beat of Shango's drums was used to rally troops, intimidate enemies, and awaken spiritual possession. Some warriors claimed they became invulnerable after being mounted by Shango's spirit, entering the battlefield with superhuman strength and divine fury. His rituals were dramatic and intense. Worshippers danced in red and white cloth, wielding axes, breathing fire, and channeling his thunderous energy. Possessed dancers would spin, chant, and erupt in ecstatic movements, believed to be vessels of Shango himself. In these moments, the line between man and God dissolved. Every shout became a battle cry, every dance a declaration of war. Shango was especially beloved by rebel warriors and freedom fighters. His myth spread across the Atlantic, finding new homes in the Americas. In Cuba, he became Shango. In Haiti, he merged with Ogo. In Brazil, he reigned as Zango. Through the enslaved and displaced, Shango became a god of resilience, a divine king whose thunder still rolled even in chains. In the Caribbean and South America, descendants of African warriors still honor Shango before entering physical or spiritual battles. His spirit became a rallying point during slave revolts and uprisings. His legend gave people strength to fight injustice and stand tall in the face of overwhelming odds. To believe in Shango was to believe that no oppressor, no matter how powerful, was safe from divine wrath. Shango's lightning was more than a weapon, it was truth revealed. His followers say that when lightning strikes, lies are exposed and hidden things are brought to light. In war and in politics, this belief gave people courage to speak up, to act boldly, to believe that the storm was on their side. He wasn't a distant god. He was in the thunder over their heads, in the fire under their feet. To this day, Shango remains a symbol of bold leadership, fiery justice, and spiritual power. His cult is alive and growing, not just in temples but in music, protest art, and street movements. His double axe appears in graffiti, his red and white worn by rappers, dancers, and activists. He's a deity of war, but also of rhythm, rebellion, and reckoning. Shango reminds us that thunder has memory. Every crack of the sky carries echoes of his reign. Every storm a reminder that the gods of war still walk among us, judging, guiding, and ready to strike when called. In the heartlands of southern Africa, no name echoes louder in military history than that of the Zulu. But behind their legendary tactics and fearless warriors stood something even more powerful: ancestral spirits. For the Zulu, war was not just a clash of spears, it was a spiritual endeavor. Every campaign was guided by ritual, prayer, and the belief that their forefathers fought beside them. Shaka Zulu, the most iconic leader in Zulu history, understood this deeply. He was not only a master of strategy, but a spiritual tactician. Before launching any major campaign, he consulted diviners and spirit mediums. Ceremonies were held to ask for blessings from the ancestors. Offerings were made to ensure that the warriors would march with spiritual protection. Shaka didn't just build an army, he awakened a spiritual force that marched in unison with it. Zulu warriors were raised to believe that they carried the power of the Amadlozi, the ancestral spirits. These spirits weren't distant memories. They were present in dreams, battle cries, and even in the wind that swept through the tall grass before a fight. It was believed that when warriors fought bravely, their ancestors cheered, and when they showed cowardice, their ancestors turned away in shame. One of the most sacred aspects of Zulu warfare was the use of praise poetry, known as ezibongo. Before battle, warriors would chant and recite verses that honored their ancestors and declared their own lineage and might. This wasn't just motivation, it was invocation. The words called upon the spirits to lend strength, focus, and fury. Every warrior became more than a man, he became a living extension of his entire bloodline. The Zulu also had war doctors, known as Izinyanga Zempi, who prepared warriors spiritually. They anointed them with herbs, performed purification rituals, and sometimes even made them invisible to enemy eyes through spiritual masking. These war doctors were feared and respected, believed to control outcomes in ways weapons never could. Their role proved that to the Zulu, the most important weapon wasn't the spear, it was the unseen force behind it. Defeated enemies often claimed they were overwhelmed, not just by numbers, but by a terrifying spiritual presence. Zulu warriors moved in tight formations, chanted as one, and struck with precision, yet their power felt supernatural. Colonizers described facing them as meeting ghosts with spears. That reputation wasn't accidental. It was built through centuries of belief and spiritual discipline. Even in death, Zulu warriors didn't truly leave the battlefield. Fallen heroes were honored through rituals that kept their spirits close. Weapons were buried with them, songs sung in their memory, and their names etched into communal lore. These spirits would, in turn, guide the living. A Zulu army didn't fear death. They believed it meant joining the eternal regiment of the ancestors. Shaka's successors carried on the fusion of war and spirit. In the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879, spiritual preparation remained central. The Battle of Isandlwana, one of the greatest African military victories over a colonial power, is still attributed not just to strategy, but to the blessings of the ancestors. Zulu oral history insists that their spirits rose that day, shielding their descendants and confusing their enemies. Today, the Zulu maintain strong ancestral traditions. Before important events, warriors and leaders alike still consult spiritual elders. Traditional songs and chants are performed in military parades. Their history isn't trapped in museums. It lives in every ritual, every dance, every name whispered to the wind. The Zulu know that no warrior stands alone. To understand Zulu warfare is to understand a worldview where time bends, where the past is not behind you, but beside you, where the living and the dead fight shoulder to shoulder. Their power was never just in numbers or weapons. It was, and still is, in the spirits who never stopped marching. Beneath the surface of African warfare lies a hidden layer of mystery. Secret war cults, warrior brotherhoods, and mystical fighters who wielded fear as their sharpest weapon. These weren't just combatants, they were spiritual elites, chosen by destiny and trained in sacred rites. In many regions, victory wasn't determined by strength alone. It was shaped in the dark, in ceremonies far from the battlefield, where spirits whispered strategy. One such example is the Egungun masquerade. Found in Yoruba culture, the Egungun are ancestral spirits embodied by masked dancers. But these weren't mere performances, they were spiritual reanimations. In wartime, Egungun processions could be summoned to bless armies, curse enemies, or terrify spies. Their appearance, bright, elaborate, and otherworldly, signaled that the dead were watching. Their movement, unpredictable and swift, gave the illusion of spirits in full motion. In some warrior cults, initiation was brutal and transformative. Recruits were stripped of identity, taken to remote forests, and trained in both combat and ritual. They learned not only how to fight, but how to vanish through camouflage, misdirection, or magical rites. They swore oaths that bound them for life. Some were said to possess powers of night walking, entering enemy camps unseen, leaving signs of their passage, bones, feathers, cryptic warnings, meant to destabilize minds before a battle even began. Masks played a critical role in these cults. Far beyond decoration, they were believed to hold spiritual energy. A masked warrior could be seen as something more than human, perhaps an ancestor, perhaps a beast, perhaps a god. These visual symbols struck terror in enemies unfamiliar with their meanings. The fear of the unknown was a weapon. When an enemy believes you are not entirely of this world, their courage crumbles before the fight begins. In Central and West Africa, night-fighting societies emerged that specialized in psychological warfare. Warriors would make eerie sounds, whistles, wails, growls at night, surrounding enemy camps, depriving them of sleep and morale. Fires would be lit in patterns to confuse and disorient. Sometimes, mirrors were used in rituals to bend light, confusing pursuers or allowing escape. These techniques, part magic, part military genius, turned darkness into a weapon. Blood pacts were another key element. Members of these war cults often made sacred agreements sealed in blood or scarification. These pacts were more than loyalty, they were spiritual contracts. Breaking one meant not just dishonor, but divine punishment. It created warriors with unbreakable bonds, willing to die rather than abandon a mission or betray a brother. Women also played roles in these mystical traditions. In Dahomey, modern-day Benin, the famed all-female warriors known as the Agoji were part of a sacred order. Trained from childhood, they fought with ferocity and ritual discipline. They were believed to be spiritually fortified, immune to fear and pain, protected by charms and incantations passed down by priestesses. Their presence on the battlefield was not only strategic, it was spiritual warfare embodied. Colonial forces often struggled to understand or defeat these cult-based warriors. British and French soldiers frequently reported confusion, disarray, and unexpected defeats against what they saw as primitive fighters. They didn't realize that they were facing entire networks of spiritually and psychologically trained combatants who had been preparing in secret for generations. Even after colonization, many of these war cults persisted underground. Some morphed into resistance movements. Others shifted into religious or fraternal societies, preserving the codes, chants, and rites of their ancestors. Today, echoes of their rituals can be found in community ceremonies, initiation practices, and secret gatherings. The war has changed, but the warriors, those shaped by mystery and myth, have never truly vanished. In these brotherhoods, war was not chaos. It was choreography. Every ritual, every mask, every whisper in the night was part of a larger strategy, a sacred art passed through bloodlines and bound by belief. They remind us that the battlefield isn't always where the fight begins. Sometimes it starts in silence, behind masks, with warriors born not in barracks, but in shadows. As colonial powers carved up Africa, drawing lines across sacred lands and silencing ancestral traditions, many assumed African spirituality would disappear under the pressure of gunpowder and Christian crosses. They were wrong. In the face of imperial domination, war gods returned, not as forgotten relics, but as living forces in resistance. Across the continent, spiritual warfare became the soul of political rebellion. One of the most striking examples is the Maji Maji Rebellion in what is now Tanzania. In 1905, thousands of people rose against German colonial rule, united by a spiritual leader named Kinjekitile Mwale. He claimed to be possessed by a spirit called Shango and distributed war medicine that would supposedly turn German bullets into water. The movement blended indigenous belief with militant strategy. Though militarily outmatched, the rebellion showed how spiritual conviction could mobilize vast numbers and threaten colonial control. Colonial soldiers were often bewildered by their opponents' fearlessness. They wrote of warriors advancing without flinching, singing prayers, and wearing talismans of iron, bone, and cloth. What they saw as madness was actually spiritual armor. Belief in divine protection, especially from gods like Ogun or ancestral spirits, created fighters who would not turn back, even when the odds were hopeless. In Kenya, the Mau Mau uprising of the 1950s fused Kikuyu spiritual traditions with revolutionary zeal. Fighters underwent secret oathing ceremonies in forests, binding them to each other and to the land through ancestral pacts. These oaths weren't just symbols, they were seen as binding spiritual contracts. The rituals, chants, and prayers invoked not only unity but the wrath of ancestors against colonial occupiers and traitors. Even outside organized religion, African war gods morphed into symbols of defiance. In West Africa, Ogun was reinvented not just as a god of blacksmiths, but as a divine insurgent, one who blessed the forge and the fighter alike. Rebels invoked his name before sabotaging railroads or raiding colonial outposts. Shango's thunder was seen as approval from above. Lightning strikes became omens, messages from the gods that liberation was near. Resistance leaders often adapted traditional symbolism to create unity. In Nigeria, spiritual societies like the Ekpe or Ogboni operated under the radar, passing messages, initiating fighters, and protecting secrets. Their sacred symbols, often misunderstood by colonial authorities, acted as codes of communication and warning. To the initiated, they were instructions. To outsiders, just patterns on walls. Even after independence, these spiritual traditions didn't fade. In places where governments turned corrupt or oppressive, new generations turned again to ancestral war deities, not just for protection, but for guidance. Protest movements in South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Nigeria often included rituals, invocations, and spiritual leaders who called upon the power of the old gods to embolden the youth and inspire action. Artists, musicians, and poets began to revive these myths as tools of cultural reclamation. Fela Kuti, for instance, frequently referenced Yoruba deities like Ogun and Shango in his music, using them not only as metaphors but as revolutionary calls. His songs were spiritual resistance, channeling ancient rage through modern sound. In this way, the gods returned, not on altars but on stages and radios. Diaspora communities in the Americas also leaned on these gods during their own struggles. During the Haitian Revolution, leaders like Dutty Boukman called upon African spirits before launching uprisings. Ogun, Shango, and other orishas were invoked in battle. Their names cried out beside calls for freedom. These gods crossed oceans, survived plantations, and lived on in secret languages, veiled rituals, and coded songs. Today, these traditions continue to evolve. In modern activism, symbols of African war gods appear in protests, murals, and even fashion. Young Africans reclaim their spiritual heritage, not just as culture, but as a political weapon. The gods of war are no longer confined to shrines. They're found on t-shirts, in spoken word poetry, in the courage of activists who face police lines with chants and raised fists. What colonial powers failed to understand was that African war gods were never simply figures of mythology, they were blueprints for resistance. They taught discipline, courage, unity, and the unbreakable link between belief and action. And in times of oppression, they reawaken, not as stories, but as strategies. Though the battles of old may have ended, the war gods of Africa have never gone silent. Their echoes ripple through modern life, in music, art, politics, and even street protests. These deities, once summoned by warriors on dusty battlefields, now live in city graffiti, hip-hop lyrics, and the tattoos of revolutionaries. The gods haven't disappeared, they've adapted. In cities across Africa and the diaspora, symbols of Ogun, Shango, and other war deities are being reclaimed by younger generations. Ogun's iron now represents not just weaponry, but resistance through industry, welding, construction, coding. He is invoked in creative spaces where people build their futures. Shango's lightning becomes the symbol of rebellion, justice, and charismatic leadership. He shows up on protest posters, in political cartoons, and in the fiery speeches of activists. Modern musicians often channel these deities, blending traditional rhythm with contemporary message. Afrobeat artists like Burna Boy and rappers across West Africa weave ancestral names and spiritual metaphors into their tracks. In Brazil, candomblé practitioners honor Ogun in samba lyrics. In Trinidad and Haiti, Shango's spirit is called upon in chants, reminding listeners that rhythm and resistance have always been twins. In contemporary conflicts, war gods are still present, not just as beliefs, but as cultural frameworks. In some militia movements or rural resistance groups, members carry charms or participate in rituals to gain protection or courage. Even in cities, spiritual healers offer warriors' blessings to young men facing gang violence, political chaos, or existential crises. Ogun's iron isn't just in swords anymore, it's in steering wheels, power tools, and microphones. Art has also become a sacred battleground. Graffiti murals in Lagos, Dakar, and Johannesburg depict war gods with modern twists. Shango in a hoodie wielding thunder, Ogun holding a wrench instead of a machete. These images aren't just aesthetics, they are spiritual declarations. The gods still matter, and they are watching. Fashion has embraced this revival too. Designers incorporate traditional war symbols into streetwear. Red and white beads for Shango, iron motifs for Ogun, war masks reimagined as sunglasses or jewelry. It's cultural memory worn proudly and defiantly. A style that says, we know where we come from, and we know who walks with us. Even in political speeches and grassroots movements, the language of war gods persists. Leaders invoke ancestors, speak of divine justice, and wear charms under their suits. In places where formal systems have failed, spirituality offers a foundation, one that connects struggle to something deeper than policy. Identity, legacy, and purpose. The digital world hasn't left these traditions behind. TikTok creators and YouTube historians explore African war gods with stunning visuals and storytelling. Young people remix chants, animate myths, and explain rituals with flair and pride. Online, Shango's lightning becomes viral. Ogun's fire fuels empowerment content. The gods have gone global, digital, and deeply personal. But it's not all symbolic. In places facing real violence or unrest, these gods still serve their original role: protectors, guides, and motivators. Community rituals still ask Ogun for strength. Elders still pour libations to warriors past. And in tense moments, elections, uprisings, clashes, the war gods are remembered, called upon in whispers and cries. More than relics, they are resilience. They connect generations, inspire courage, and restore dignity in the face of fear. To believe in them today is not to live in the past, but to claim the right to fight for a future rooted in ancestral power. Africa's war gods are no longer confined to dusty shrines or fading chants. They live in the beats of the drum, the crackle of protest fire, and the iron tools that build tomorrow. Their myths are blueprints. Their stories, strategies, and their names still carry thunder. Across centuries, continents, and countless battles, Africa's war gods have never truly faded. They began as divine symbols of strength, justice, and protection, but became something far greater. They shaped empires, inspired revolts, and ignited cultural firestorms. From the forests of Yoruba lands to the streets of Rio and the rebel camps of Kenya, they marched with warriors, whispered to leaders, and demanded courage in the face of conquest. These gods weren't passive icons. They were active forces. Ogun sharpened more than blades, he sharpened resolve. Shango hurled more than lightning, he hurled judgment. Zulu spirits turned warriors into legends. Secret cults taught that real power came not from fear but from knowing exactly who you are and who walks with you. Even today, when the weapons have changed and the battlefields have shifted, the gods remain, not always in ritual, but in rhythm. Not only in masks, but in meaning. They remind us that war, when guided by purpose and anchored in spirit, can be sacred. That resistance, when shaped by memory, becomes unstoppable. And that strength, when drawn from something older than fear, can never be truly conquered. These stories aren't just history. They're blueprints for legacy, courage, and self-determination. They challenge us to ask, what do we fight for? What do we protect? and what ancestral fire still burns in our blood. If this journey moved you, subscribe for more untold stories that connect myth, memory, and meaning. Like the video, share the legend, and keep the gods alive, not just in words, but in the way you walk through the world.